Hello, today we're talking Chapter 5, Evolution of Biodiversity. And before I start this chapter, I just want to start with a disclaimer of, you know, evolution is controversial in education. And my job is simply to give you the information that the science supports. It doesn't mean that you have to believe in evolution. I'm just giving you the info. Okay, so with that, I'm not going to really go into much detail to use up time, but do read page 119, the introduction story of chapter 5, as it directly relates to the video that we were watching in class, Medicine Man. So Earth is home to a tremendous diversity of species, and the crazy part is that most of everything that has ever lived on Earth is already extinct. So there are three types of diversity that ecologists use. And let's start from the bottom. Genetic diversity is the variety of genes within a given species, and then the different species in a given ecosystem, and then all the different ecosystems in a given region or biome. So here are some examples of what high diversity and low diversity look like. On the left, you see a variety of trees and plants. So it would be reasonable to assume that it's pretty diverse. On the right, you see a plantation basically or a forest that has essentially one species of tree, making it have low diversity. Well, how many species do live on Earth? So remember that a species is defined as a group of organisms that are distinct from other groups in terms of their size, shape, behavior, properties, and that they can interbreed with other individuals to produce offspring. Okay, so they have to be able to interbreed and produce offspring. So far to date, 2 million species have been identified and named. That's a heck of a lot of species to identify, but doesn't come anywhere close to what scientists think is actually on the Earth. So estimates range from anywhere from 5 million to 100 million species, but most agree that there are about 10 million species currently on Earth. And again, 99% of all species that have ever lived are now extinct. They will generally have, a species will generally have a lifetime of 10 million years. Not a lifetime, but you know that that species will stick around before going extinct. So it's reasonable to assume that humans will one day become extinct as well. So when you're talking about diversity, uh, well, first of all, when you look at the number of species on Earth, that's not really an indicator of how diverse a specific area is or region is. So you look at the richness and the evenness. These are the two things that really define uh, diversity. So richness is how many different types of species there are in an area. And evenness is whether or not that area is dominated by one species or has many species. And it's talking about abundance. So sometimes um, they'll use evenness and abundance interchangeably. So let's look at an example of that. So I've got two forest communities here. Community 1 has equal amounts of 4 different trees. Community 2 has lots of type A trees and only a few of the other 2 trees. So although they both have 4 species, so the richness is the same because they have the same number of different species. Community 1 has a more even distribution. Okay, the abundance is the same, so therefore is considered more diverse. Okay, so in this example, they have the same richness, which is the same number of species, but community 1 is more diverse. When scientists want to figure out how closely related species are to one another, they will draw what's called a phylogenetic tree. And although I don't have one on this PowerPoint, you can see it on page 123 as an example. And I remember when I was in a vertebrate paleontology class at UT, um, we had to draw a phylogenetic tree, or a cladogram as they're also called, from basically the first or the beginning of life to humans. You can imagine how incredibly long uh, that tree was, trying to relate all these different species. And so, how they relate them in this kind of tree is to see where they are more similar and then where they branch off. So as you know, when they started to have a notochord, which is like a spinal cord, and then when they developed vertebrae, and then when they developed jaws, and then when they developed four legs, and then they moved on land, and when they became mammals, and when they, gained wings for flight, etc. Um, I don't know where I was right there. Hold on. I got lost in my own thoughts. Sorry. So, by putting all these similar traits kind of in order, it shows scientists how species have evolved. And evolution, in the ecology sense or biodiversity sense, is a change in the genetic composition of a population over time. Evolution generally means change over time. In biodiversity, there are two levels of evolution. One is microevolution, and that occurs below the species level, meaning it's not resulting in a new species, it's just a change in within that species. So, um, new varieties of an apple or a different fruit or flower. Down syndrome in humans. People with Down syndrome are still human, they are just different. A moth's colors, and we'll talk about a specific example in class, but how this one type of moth evolved to be a darker version as well as a white version. So it's still the same moth, just it looks different. Macroevolution is when a new species will arise. So, where does evolution actually start? Well, it starts in the genes, and genes are the locations on chromosomes within each cell. And these genes determine the range of possible traits that it can pass down to their offspring. And the complete set of genes in an individual is called its genotype. So, notice if you remember in biology, you might have learned that genotypes were the letters and phenotypes were the actual traits in words. Um, so two processes that create genetic diversity are mutations and recombinations. So we know that genes are, um, I'm sorry, that DNA is being copied millions of times as long as there are cells that are growing and dividing. And so sometimes there's an accident, there's a mistake or a random change in that genetic code, and that's a mutation. Some environmental factors can also cause mutations, such as UV radiation from the sun, X-ray radiation, other kinds of toxins can cause mutations. When those mutations will occur in the sex cells or the eggs and the sperm, then those mutations can be passed down to the next generation. Most of the time, mutations can be detrimental. Um, those could cause the offspring that carry them to die before they're born, and some um, may not be so detrimental. They may be they may be detrimental but less severe. And the example that they give in your book with these birds that look like parakeets is they're normally green, and a mutation causes some of them to come out blue. Well, they're more prone to predation when they're blue because then now they're sticking out from the green colors of the trees. So it's not a severe mutation, but it causes them not to be able to survive and reproduce. But sometimes a mutation does improve an organism's chances for survival. As long as that mutation is being able to be passed down to a next generation, it will add genetic diversity to that population and keep the species going. Recombination is when uh, chromosomes are broken off and attaches to another chromosome. So it doesn't create a new gene, but it has a new combination of genes, which brings about a different trait. Um, so the example in your book was that uh, when new gene combinations come around, you could receive new immune system protections that would be effective against viruses or bacteria. Genotypes and phenotypes, you see there, big B is dominant, little b is recessive. Okay, so evolution can occur artificially or naturally, and it can also occur by random processes, which we'll do in a second. Humans have long influenced evolution by their breeding plants and animals for the traits that we desire. So all domestic dogs are the same species as the gray wolf, seen here, as its common ancestor. And so people were breeding for generations until they could get, whatever traits that they wanted to and become more exaggerated until a new breed had been achieved. But keep in mind, they are the same species. So when humans determine what individuals or which individuals are going to breed, they cause evolution by artificial selection. And so it's not just dogs. We do horses and cattle, pigs and chickens, which you will see as well with when we do food because of how we've influenced chickens to become bigger and thicker, to have bigger breasts and legs when we buy them in the supermarket. Most of our crops are also the result of breeding. And what was interesting is that this plant right here, the wild mustard plant, was able to be, manipulated and changed to produce 6 other foods from one plant. That's artificial selection. Natural selection is when the environment selects which individuals are most likely going to survive and reproduce. Members of a population naturally are going to be different within their traits, and certain traits make those individuals better able to survive and reproduce. So, those, the genes then that produce those traits are going to be more common in the next generation. Prior to the mid 1800s, the idea that species could evolve over time had been suggested by people, scientists, and philosophers, but it wasn't until the 1830s that Darwin came along and actually put that theory um, or synthesized that theory. In 1859, he had published On the Origin of Species, and these are the 5 key ideas that what he had noticed in his observations over the 5 years on the HMS Beagle in the 1830s. He had noticed that individuals have more offspring, and not all of those offspring are going to survive. He noticed that individuals of the same species would differ in their traits, and that these traits could be passed on from parents to offspring. But he also noticed that those differences in traits are associated with differences in the ability to survive and reproduce. So in this example, he had 2 crustaceans that would produce offspring, and if you notice in this first generation, uh, they had 3 large ones and 1 small one. Well, the larger ones were more easily seen, and so they were eaten. So more small offspring would survive, and then they would reproduce in that second generation. So the smaller one reproduces with the bigger one, produces more smaller ones. Over time, then by the third generation, which isn't very long, um, this particular crustacean would evolve to only have small offspring or individuals. I had the wrong order for a second. So, natural selection does not select for specific traits and tend towards some predetermined goal like with artificial selection, since humans are choosing which organisms they want to breed. Natural selection favors the traits and improves an individual's fitness, which is its abilities to survive and reproduce. So that's where we got survival of the fittest from. So those traits that are going to improve an individual's ability to survive and reproduce are called adaptations. The last type of evolution is evolution by random processes. So I'll be going back and forth from this slide to the next. Mutations are random processes. We don't know which organisms are going to have a mutation. And remember, they can either be detrimental, which is most of the time, or sometimes it could be favored. The environment could favor that mutation, and that individual, as long as that gene is in the sex cells, it will be passed on to the offspring. So if you look at A, um, the mutation in this population of white mice is the one black mouse. Well, over time, in generations, and it's many generations, over time, that mutation, the black mouse, will go on to have more individuals in that population. Genetic drift is another random process. That is when there is a change in the genetic composition of a population over time as a result of random mating. So again, it's random, and it's particularly important in small populations because it's the random events in small populations that could very easily alter the genetic composition for the next generation. So if you look in letter B here, and on the bottom of letter B, you see a small population. There's 3 white mice and 2 black mice. If by chance the individuals who carry the genes for the black hair fail to find a mate, then those genes don't get passed on. The next generation over time could be entirely white-haired, as you see here. So this poor little black mouse didn't find a mate, didn't pass on the black genes, and then the future generation is just white, and so that particular um, phenotype of black hair would be lost. In a larger population, as you see on the top, it doesn't affect it as much because in a large population, that composition will tend to remain the same. Another type of random process is the bottleneck effect. And the bottleneck effect is a reduction in the genetic diversity of a population that is caused by a reduction in its size of the population. So that could be a habitat loss, natural disaster, hunting, etc. Um, or any kind of changes in the environment like climate change. So when a population size is reduced, the amount of genetic variation is going to also be reduced. So the smaller the number of the individuals, the smaller number of unique genotypes or combinations of genes that are present in this population. So because there are fewer genes and the genetic diversity is reduced, that's called the bottleneck effect. So you can see in this example, if there was some kind of disaster and most of these guys were wiped out and you only had 2 black and a brown survive and no white, well then once those reproduce and there's no mutation that shows up for white, then the white phenotype is lost. So genetic diversity is reduced. Lastly is the founder effect, and that is when you have a change in the population that comes from a small number of colonizing individuals. So in letter D, uh, you could say that on the mainland you had this large amount of genetic diversity, and then there were a few random organisms that end up on a new island. And if you wanted to look at this example, you could think of it as birds, that birds landed on a fresh new island. These colonizing individuals are called the founders, and they're going to give rise to another population that has a genetic composition that's different from the original population. And as you can see in this picture, the founders, none of them were brown. They were only black and white. So when and most of them were white. So when those um, mate, over time, the brown phenotype gets lost, and you can see right here what the percentages of the diversity have been reduced. So a common way in which evolution creates new species is through geographic isolation or reproductive isolation, and that leads to allopatric speciation. And allopatric means other, and patris means fatherland. So let me go to this next slide first. When you have a large population and they're going to become geographically isolated, as in this picture, you see the river comes through and splits up the population. Over time, over many generations, and it could be thousands or hundreds of thousands of years, those separate populations start to evolve independently. So their genetic diversity starts to change over time. And then eventually, those two populations become genetically distinct. So they become different. And so they've eventually become reproductively isolated, meaning that in this case, even if that river dried up and the two populations could come back together, they might no longer be able to interbreed because they became so different. They could not produce viable offspring. And that's what Darwin came to the conclusion of about its finches. He noticed that there were so many different finches with different types of beaks and different, so therefore different diets, and concluded that they had come from the same ancestor. But over time, the different finches would end up on different islands, and then over a few million years, because they were geographically isolated, they became genetically distinct and eventually became reproductively isolated, meaning they could not have viable offspring with each other. Okay, so that's allopatric speciation. New species arise by geographic or reproductive isolation. Then you have sympatric speciation, and that's the evolution of one species into two species when there's no geographic isolation. And so usually what that means is that it's happening in the same location. The most common form of sympatric speciation happens with plants. And so in this case, we're looking at wheat. Okay, so this happens through the process of polyploidy. Polyploidy is when you have an increase in the number of sets of chromosomes, and that could just be a random occurrence during the cell division um, in meiosis. So a haploid has one set of cells, and diploid have two sets of cells. So in the example here with the wheat, the ancestral form, which is basically the original form, has two sets of chromosomes, and then through unusual cell division, then there came one with four sets of chromosomes, which is letter B, and that's what we use for pasta. And then there was another random cell division, and there were six sets of chromosomes. And that's wheat that is used for bread. Once the haploid becomes a diploid, then uh, they can't interbreed with each other. They've become genetically distinct. That's sympatric speciation. It occurs mostly with plants, and it can occur with animals, just rare. An example would be orcas or killer whales. There are groups, I think they're called residential and transient orcas. They're essentially the same species because they're both orcas, and they live in the same area, but they have come to have different diets, um, and different mating rituals and different sounds or voices, and they don't interbreed with each other. So they became eventually distinct. So, how fast does evolution take? Well, anywhere from hundreds to millions of years, and the average rate of evolution is about one new species every 3 million years. That sounds pretty slow, and on a human time scale, it is. So it shows you that in the 4.5 billion years of Earth history, biological evolution has taken a really long time. So, four factors um, are influential on successful adaptation, and that is the rate of the environmental change, genetic variation, population size, and generation time. You can see in this graph that a species will better be able to adapt to an environmental change if the rate of change is relatively slow, the population has high genetic variation for natural selection to act on, if the population is relatively small, and the generation time is short. I do suggest that you read those pages more in depth, which is page 133. Evolution can occur even more rapidly in populations of GMOs, or genetically modified organisms. So, kind of like with artificial selection, scientists will take genes from the species with a desirable trait. So, if it'll grow faster or if it's able to resist disease better, and they will actually insert those genes into species using genetic engineering techniques, and they will produce these genetically modified organisms. So when those organisms reproduce, they're going to pass on the inserted genes to their offspring. And we'll talk about that a lot more when we get to agriculture and the food unit, and we're watching Food Inc. Because GMOs are actually it's a controversial topic because what it has done, it has actually reduced the amount of diversity of fruits and vegetables and crops that we actually eat. Range of tolerance. Well, all species have an optimal environment in which it will perform well. So the limit to the abiotic conditions that they can tolerate is known as the range of tolerance. So with fish or many aquatic organisms are sensitive to what temperature it is or how much salt there is or where or animals or where they're located or how much water they have available to them. Um, and so that will determine if they're going to be able to survive, grow, and reproduce. So as you can see in this graphic, if they get a little bit beyond that range of tolerance, they may be able to survive, but they're not probably going to be able to reproduce. And if they're not going to be able to survive and reproduce, then these species will go extinct. So the ideal conditions for a species would be considered its fundamental niche. Some um, species can live under a wide range of conditions, meaning they can live just about anywhere, they have a broad diet, so they can eat just about anything, or they could survive on lack of water for a while. So think of a cockroach. That would definitely be a generalist. More K-selected species tend, excuse me, more R-selected species tend to be generalists. And then specialists are the opposite. They can only tolerate certain diets or certain latitudes or certain climates. And those would be specialists, which would resemble K-selected species. So here are two examples right here. Fossils are the remains of organisms that have been preserved in rock. Note that fossils are only found in sedimentary rock. Much of what we know about evolution comes from the fossil record, and we'll look at the geologic time scale later on in the class. Um, Two things have to happen for an organism to become a fossil. It has to have rapid burial, and it has to have hard parts. It took me a second to remember. It has to have hard parts. So that's the reason why it's really hard for us to find invertebrate fossils um, and most of them do have bones or shells. There have been five global mass extinctions in the biological evolution of organisms on Earth. So, a mass extinction is basically when a large amount of species go extinct over a short amount of time. The biggest one was 245 million years ago, which you can see right here. And that was the Great Permian Extinction, in which about 90% of organisms on the Earth went extinct. And the most common theory is due to climate change. Relatively short period of time, meaning a few thousand years, um, up to maybe even a million years, not only a few years. The one that you're probably most familiar with is the KT boundary, which is when 65 million years ago, right here, uh, scientists believe an asteroid hit the Earth, which shot up lots of dust into the air, blocking out sunlight, which prevented photosynthesis, which then it caused the herbivores to die, which then caused the carnivores to die. But the good thing about that mass extinction in the end was that because the dinosaurs became extinct, it allowed the mammals to procreate and proliferate, and that period then became known as the Age of Mammals. And again, we'll talk about some of this more in class. So during the last 2 decades, scientists have decided that we are currently experiencing a sixth global mass extinction. Estimates of extinction rates do vary quite a bit, ranging from as much as 2% to as much as 25% of species going extinct by 2020. And it is being caused by humans, including habitat destruction, overharvesting of crops, introducing invasive species either on purpose or by accident, climate change, pollution, diseases that are coming. Um, and so, because of human activities, we are causing more extinctions, and because these animals cannot adapt quick enough to the changes that humans are causing. Um, and that's going to lead us to the next chapter, which is chapter 18, which is preserving biodiversity. And that's one reason why it's so important that we save the rainforest and we save the coral reefs, so that we can preserve biodiversity. This chapter is done. This is a very vocabulary heavy chapter. Some terms you may not have heard in a while or never heard before. So make sure that you have read through this chapter, and we'll talk in class.